I would just say by default, just opening the camera.
Yeah, but I gotta be. Welcome to today's event. My name is David Walsh. I've been the arts editor of the World Socialist website since its launch in 1998. I'll be moderating today's discussion along with Christoph Andreyer, the National Secretary of the Socialist Workers' Equality Party in Germany. Today we'll be speaking to David North, the National Chairman of the Socialist Equality Party in the US and Chairman of the World Socialist Website International Editorial Board. Dave has been active for many, many years, more than half a century in socialist politics. He's the author of numerous books on the history of the Fourth International and Leon Trotsky and a whole series of questions. The two books we'll be focused on today are Sounding the Alarm, Socialism Against War, and The Logic of Zionism, From Nationalist Myth to the Gaza Genocide. Sounding the Alarm, which I'll be concentrating on, is a compilation of May Day speeches that Dave delivered between 2014 and 2024. The Logic of Zionism is a collection of lectures he gave over the last year in response to the horrifying Israeli genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza. And Christoph and I will alternate posing questions. The discussion is being hosted on the WSWS and live streamed on X, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And we certainly encourage everyone watching to leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. Clearly, we are meeting today in an extremely tense, dangerous moment. This week, the US and UK authorized Ukraine to fire long-range missiles into Russia, crossing a red line that threatens to trigger a nuclear response. Whether or not war has been officially declared, a state of war effectively exists between the US and Russia, the world's major nuclear armed powers. We also stand on the eve of Trump's coming back to power as he goes about putting together a cabinet of right-wing fanatics, criminals, and fascist ignoramuses. We are once again on the sloping side of a volcano that Trotsky referred to in 1939. The analysis presented here in these books is critical to the working class finding a way out of the present predicament. Sounding the Alarm provides, first of all, an important account of the past decade or so and its central episodes, including the COVID pandemic, the US elections of 2016 and 2020, the January 6th attempted coup by Trump, the deepening economic crisis, and many other features of recent history, including the practice and experience of the World Trotskyist movement as it fights to build a revolutionary party in the working class. These are not holiday speeches, nor mere tributes to the origins and history of May Day, as significant as that is, or nostalgia, but using that important workers' event as the occasion to make clear, bringing to bear the long history of the socialist movement, what the present situation is, what the standpoint of the world working class needs to be, what actions should be taken, which is the way forward. There are also important commentaries on the 1917 Russian Revolution, on the life and work of Karl Marx, on Trotsky's great contributions, on Lenin's imperialism. An article from 2014 announcing the first rally includes a 5-page review of the period since 2014, or since 1914, that will provide the reader with a short course in the history of the past century. As the title indicates, Sound the Alarm, Socialism Against War, at the center of the book is an analysis of the war danger as it emerged and developed over the past decade, the threat that imperialism represents to the world's population and civilization itself, epitomized by the US-NATO escalation and drive to war against Russia and the Gaza Genocide, the first stages of a new world war. My first question, perhaps an obvious one, what were the circumstances And what was the thinking that lay behind the international Trotskyist movement's decision to initiate the May Day rallies in 2014?
Thank you, Dave, for that introduction. Going back to 2014, we, of course, were aware that this was the centenary of what was, in fact, a central event in modern history. You might say the event which was, or one of the two events which were to define the development of subsequent history, subsequent events, that is the outbreak of World War I in August of 1914, and 3 years later, the Russian Revolution, culminating in October 1917 in the conquest of power by the Bolshevik Party under the leadership of Lenin and Trotsky. Now, in the years just preceding 2014, we had been holding a number of meetings in which we were emphasizing the very, you might say, curious might not be the correct word, but the clear similarity in many respects between the period between 1998 and 1913, actually 1898 and 1913, and 1998 and 2013. That is, the first and earlier period was the period of the emergence of imperialism and the years that set the stage for the outbreak of World War I. It was a period of the emergence of imperialism and the increasing geopolitical contradictions on a world scale that were suddenly to explode in the summer of 1914. And it was also a period of the intensification of social conflict, particularly bound up with the emergence of a mass socialist movement that was also such an important factor in the conditions of the time. Now, of course, to recall the famous phrase of Mark Twain, history doesn't repeat itself, but it tends to rhyme. There were very definite similarities which we noted, that the period since the end of the 20th century, 1998, had been a period which had been marked by continuous intensification of global geopolitical conflict, the outbreak of a whole series of wars, the wars that had taken place largely since in the aftermath of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the wars in Yugoslavia, the war against Serbia, which had been launched by the United States and NATO in 1998, then the invasion of Afghanistan in the aftermath of 9/11, followed by the invasion of Iraq. This continuous escalation of military operations in Libya, in Syria, all of these in many ways resembled the conditions which had preceded the outbreak of World War I, and was clearly indicating that we had entered a period of immense conflict, extremely sharp intensification of imperialist preparations for war, and also a period of growing social crisis, economic crisis. In particular, of course, the crash of 2008, which thoroughly destabilized the world capitalist system and intensified all the internal pressures to find a way out of the crisis of the world capitalist system, and particularly the crisis of American capitalism through war. And so when we began, and I would say it was actually beginning to use online events as a means of commemorating May Day, that we drew attention to these fundamental contradictions and sought to root the events which we were now confronting in a broader historical analysis. That, in a certain sense, was the background. It might have seemed coincidental, but we as I said, we had been for some time in the WSWS, in the major documents of the Socialist Equality Party and the ICFI, we had been stressing the historical similarity, if you wish, between the period between 1898 and 1913 and 1998 and 2013.
Well, I think the results obviously have been very powerful and vindicate those decisions. Widely watched and I think deeply felt, and both intellectually powerful and also very emotionally moving. Moving on to sort of the concrete situation, according to the media, the various governments, the various NATO governments, the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 was unprovoked and essentially had no prehistory. The authoritarian Putin got out of bed one day and decided to put an end to democratic little Ukraine and impose his own form of rule. But for many years, especially after the 2014 coup in Ukraine, the WSWS foresaw this war would erupt. I'd like to run a few slides, or I'm going to read the passages. I hope we have the slides, because I think if the reader or the listener, the watcher will bear with me, there's a number of paragraphs here, but I think they're worth recalling, and they're also very eloquent and passionate passages. And this first is from the April 12th, 2014 appeal for the first May Day rally. And it said, in the past year alone, the United States has escalated military operations aimed at encircling China, threatened war against Syria and Iran, and most recently organized a coup in Ukraine with the intention of provoking a confrontation with Russia. Again, this is April 2014, 8 years before the unprovoked war erupted. The confrontation with Russia over Ukraine marks a new and dangerous turn in the orientation of the imperialist powers. The next slide, if you want to go to it. The gods of imperialist war are athirst. As in the years that preceded World War I and World War II, a new division of the world is being prepared. This is all from the April 12th, 2014 statement. Those who believe that war with China and Russia is an impossibility, that the major imperialist powers would not risk war with nuclear powers, are deluding themselves. The history of the 20th century, with its two devastating world wars and its innumerable and very bloody localized conflicts, has provided sufficient evidence of the risks the imperialist ruling classes are prepared to take. Indeed, they are prepared to risk the fate of all humanity and the planet itself. 100 years after the outbreak of World War I and 75 years after the start of World War II, the struggle against the danger of a third imperialist cataclysm confronts the international working class. And these final two paragraphs are from the 2015 May Day rally itself. The events of the past year have made it all too clear that these regional interventions are part of an emerging global battle plan. The United States is escalating simultaneously its confrontation with Russia and China. With extraordinary recklessness, the Obama administration has taken actions that seem calculated to provoke a Russian military response. The U.S. orchestration of the Ukrainian coup in February 2014 initiated a confrontation with a nuclear-armed Russia. Far from seeking to pull back from the brink, the United States, with the support of Germany and other NATO powers, is intensifying economic and military pressure against Russia. I mean, it hardly needs to be said before this audience that all of this has come to pass and more. So I'd ask Dave, although it's a fairly sweeping question, how was it possible to make such estimates and predictions, which no one else made?
Well, I would like to think this was entirely original, but it's not. I'm fortunate. I'm a member of the Trotskyist movement, a movement which bases itself on Marxism, and Marxism is a powerful tool of analysis, rooted in history and equipped with a dialectical approach, which examines events, even those which are ongoing, as a process. That is, every event has a history which preceded it. It's not just a moment in time. It has vast historical interconnections. And as I was saying in the previous question, clearly the background of the events of 2014 were very much present when we were examining and discussing, in preparation for the May Day event, the significance of the unfolding conflict in Ukraine. I just will recall that the event in May Day 2014 was preceded by several months by the so-called Maidan Revolution, which was in fact a coup organized principally by the United States and Germany to essentially seize control of the Ukrainian government and utilize Ukraine as a base of operations against Russia. Now, the cliche of the unprovoked war, as we always know, is throughout history, the question of who fired the first shot is a powerful instrument of political propaganda. As if there's a first shot which sets into motion something as huge as a war. I think, as people know from their own personal lives, when a fight breaks out in a family, everyone accuses everyone else of starting it. And everyone has a version of how it began, who said what to whom. And of course, there usually are longer and deeper reasons why such disputes break out. Now, when we're talking about geopolitical conflict, something on a scale so massive, I mean, it's not difficult to establish, based on historical study, that all immense struggles, wars being the most monumental, have a history. I think there's a line in, there is a line in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet where Romeo says, "On this day's black fate more days doth depend." What happened in 2014 played a huge role in determining what took place in 2022. Putin did not just wake up one morning and say he wanted a war. Now, we don't in any way absolve Putin of responsibility for what took place. The decision to invade Ukraine was monumentally reactionary, and it reflected the political bankruptcy of the regime that came to power in the aftermath of the dissolution of the USSR. But there is no question that the situation, which you might say provoked Putin, which led to his bad decision, which has had consequences which he clearly did not foresee, or which he vastly underestimated, are rooted in an antecedent crisis of imperialism, which has a long prehistory. It always is a question when one discusses wars. Well, how far back do you want to go? How far back should we go in discussing the origins of the war in Ukraine? Should we go back to the Maidan coup of 2014? Should we go back to the so-called Orange Revolution of 2005? Should we go even further back to the alliance of Ukrainian nationalists with the Nazis in the Second World War, or perhaps to the various right-wing regimes which were erected in Ukraine during the period of the Russian Civil War? It's very important to note, and I think in one of the speeches I may have referred to it, Trotsky often wrote just on the eve of World War II. He wrote on the Ukrainian question, and he defined Ukraine as a central problem of European history, of European development. And he stressed that there could be no progressive solution to Ukraine apart from a socialist revolution. And on that basis, he denounced the nationalist policies of the Stalinist regime. But when we look at Ukraine, and I think all subsequent events have shown, we're clearly talking about much more than the character of the government that will reside in Kiev. I mean, the United States, really, to be blunt, couldn't give a damn about the Ukrainian people, about the fate of Ukraine. It's simply small change in a much broader struggle for global hegemony. I think, as we point out in a number of the speeches as the war unfolded, if you want to understand Ukraine and the interests which the United States has, you have to look at the world situation. You have to place it within the context of the global aspirations of the United States, its intensifying conflict with China, and of course the strategic issues which are bound up with who controls the vast territories of Eurasia, which are largely presently occupied by Russia, and who will have access to the vast natural resources which are in Russia. I think, the potential value of these resources of gold, platinum, molybdenum, zinc, copper, they are in the trillions and trillions of dollars. So a great deal is at stake. Strategic interests are involved. And that is where one should look for the cause of the war. And we were aware of that. In other words, we have the benefit of working with a Marxist method, with a Marxist conception of history, which evaluates historical events or examines historical events not from the standpoint of individual motives, of one or another individual, good or bad, but rather from the broader social forces which are involved, the powerful objective forces which determine and shape historical events. In other words, they are the critical issues, and the various propaganda narratives are nothing more than that. They're propaganda narratives which are utilized to confuse and delude the population.
Right? These are important and big questions. Christoph, would you like to raise some issues at this point?
Analysis often to understand the present conflicts, understanding of the developments behind. And this is, of course, also very significant for the second book we are discussing, The Logic of Zionism, which contains lectures written after October 7. And the first of the lectures actually was held just 2.5 weeks after October 7th, after the genocide against the Palestinian peoples just started. And yet, the analysis you present of the global political and historical background to the genocide are really fundamental to understanding it. You focus on the fundamental historical and political questions. And this begins with an assessment of Zionism, which became a reality not on the basis of Theodor Herzl's theories, but much more on the basis of the greatest defeats of the working class in the 1930s, which then led to fascism and to the Holocaust. You write in your book that Israel emerged from this tragedy, and in this context you quote Isaac Deutscher, who wrote the world has compelled the Jew to embrace the nation state and make of it his pride and hope just at a time when there is little or no hope left in it. So what does this mean for the historical development of the state of Israel up to today's genocide?
Well, again, I just want to make a few points about the war, since the last question raised the issue of propaganda narratives. Just as it's impossible to discuss the war in Ukraine on the basis of who fired the first shot, the invasion of February 22nd, 2022. You might say it's no less impossible, but even more outrageous, given the circumstances which confront the Palestinian people and the people who live in Gaza, to discuss the events of October 7th apart from all that preceded it, and that is the long history spanning, at that time, over 75 years of oppression and crimes committed by the Zionist movement, bound up with the dispossession of the Palestinian people, their ejection from their homeland. A central point that I was seeking to make, and I think they are in all the lectures on the war, the genocide, is that Zionism was and has remained an illegitimate and reactionary solution, a non-solution to the historical problem of the persecution of the Jews, anti-Semitism. And there are a number of reasons for that from a historical and also ideological standpoint. First of all, that it takes the question of the persecution of the Jews and even the question of anti-Semitism out of any serious historical context. Underlying all the self-justifications which the Israeli regime gives and the Zionists give for their actions and crimes is essentially that anti-Semitism is a fixed, universal, unchanging element of history. If you wanted to state it most bluntly, their views are the world hates the Jew, and therefore the Jew has a right to hate everybody else. And but of course, this is a horrible falsification of history. No doubt there is a long and terrible history of the persecution of Jews and hatred of Jews, bound up with religious antagonisms, prejudices, and so on. But modern anti-Semitism, which emerges in the late 19th century, acquired new characteristics. And in its development was very much bound up with hostility and fear of the growth of the socialist movement. It was for a good reason that Engels described, or Lassalle described anti-Semitism as the socialism of fools. It was a means of whipping up popular or diverting popular hostility to the evils and oppressive conditions of capitalism against a target which could be easily victimized, the Jewish population. And that was intensified by the fact that such a significant section of the Jewish proletariat was attracted to socialism. And so anti-Semitism became a potent weapon in the struggle against socialism. Now, there's much more which can be said about this, and I hope we'll have a chance to review this in greater detail. But specifically to the point which you raised, and I think it is critical to understand this in historical terms, and you hinted on it in your question. The tragedy of the foundation of the state of Israel. And it is a tragedy. It's a tragedy for the Palestinians. It is a tragedy potentially for the Jewish people. And it already is a moral tragedy for Jews, particularly a people who had experienced such immense oppression, now being in the state of Israel, transformed into oppressors. For the real historical precondition for the establishment of the state of Israel were not the backward conceptions of Theodor Herzl, which had limited popularity prior to 1933, but the possibility of Zionism obtaining a mass popular base was entirely bound up with the defeat of the working class in Germany and subsequently in all of Europe in the aftermath of the conquest of power by the Nazis in 1933. That sets the stage for the transformation of Zionism into a political movement which, simply as of the force of horrible circumstances, placed Jews in a situation where Palestine was presented as the only possibility for their salvation. But it was a false salvation, and in the long term, it was instrumental in separating the Jewish proletariat and broad sections of the Jewish intelligentsia who had been attracted to socialism away from an internationalist revolutionary world outlook into a reactionary nationalist outlook. And the point that Deutscher made in his really wonderful essay was that, and I think he said it very, very well, he said that the essence of the tragedy was that in the form of Israel, in the form of Zionism, the Jews created a national state at a time when the national state had already become anachronistic, not only in the Middle East, not only was the state of Israel anachronistic, but all of national solutions had become anachronistic. The national state no longer played a progressive role in the development of humanity. And he made the point that it's not only true for Israel, it's true for the United States, it's true for Britain. One of the characteristics we see in the present period is the breaking up of even the old established national states. They all are being torn by centrifugal pressures. The United Kingdom is becoming increasingly less viable as the national state is more and more incompatible with the global character of world economy. It's true for the United States. The tensions which find expression most recently in the election of Trump sort of point to a breakup, and it could lead to a breakup of the United States. So the entire concept of establishing a national state as a salvation, homeland for the Jews, was by its very nature reactionary, and by the logic of that reactionary policy has led to the really criminal policies. They're not accidental. They're not just a product of the malevolent Netanyahu and the gang of fascists, but rather Netanyahu and the gang of fascists are the outcome and the expression of the project itself, the national project, which is epitomized by Zionism, a product of an ideology which is anachronistic and therefore reactionary, and therefore must find the most terrible, or find itself expressed in the most terrible criminal deeds.
Yeah, and you show very powerfully in your book how this is directed, this form of ideology, very much against the progressive, the Marxist, the Socialist, the Spinozaist traditions of Jewish thought. And you're quoting then further from Deutscher, who ends his text with the hope that together with other nations, the Jews will ultimately become aware or regain the awareness of the inadequacy of the nation state, and that they will find their way back to the moral and political heritage that the genius of the Jews who have gone beyond Jewry has left us, the message of universal human emancipation. And yeah, that's a very powerful conclusion out of this analysis of the dead end or the reactionary role of the nation state, and it's also vindicated by the fact that millions of Jews around the world protesting against the genocide and are shocked by the events in Israel. But maybe we can discuss one other question that is connected to this, and that's of course the question of anti-Semitism. Because when you talk about ideological propaganda using certain narratives which have nothing to do with reality, this is a very clear example for this. But of course, in Germany, the question of anti-Semitism is a very sensitive one. It's workers are, of course, hostile towards anti-Semitism given the German past. But now what we are witnessing is that these sentiments are really misused in order to justify the support for the genocide in Gaza, to suppress any opposition against the genocide. And you're analyzing in the Logic of Zionism how the concept of anti-Semitism is really being turned into its opposite. You call it a semantic inversion. While anti-Semitism used to describe the racist ideology of the far right, which was closely connected to its anti-communism, as you just explained, it is now, as you said, used as a swear word to denounce and discredit those who fight for democratic rights, human equality, and, of course, socialism. So, what do you think are the consequences of this reinterpretation, and what can be done to counter it?
Well, there tends to be an oppressive use of language. I suppose it's part of bourgeois ideology, the idea that language creates reality, and if you utilize falsifications, you can actually create a false reality which people will believe and act upon. What I refer to as semantic inversion is to take a phenomena which was well known, the utilization of hatred of Jews as a political instrument for the implementation of the most reactionary policies, the diversion of popular hatred and away from capitalism and directed toward a scapegoat. In other words, the whole significance of anti-Semitism as a political phenomenon has been turned into its opposite. I mean, the question of anti-Semitism as it developed in the early part of the or the discussion of anti-Semitism in the late 19th and early 20th century, as it developed in the labor movement, became very clear. The origins of political anti-Semitism actually, as a political movement, of course, hatred of Jews existed, and it was fueled by religious antagonisms by the Catholic Church and Protestant churches. This was not unknown, but it was only in the late 19th century that it actually developed into a politically conscious movement, and the origins of that was in Vienna, where a populist politician by the name of Karl Lueger became mayor of Vienna, and he developed his movement largely on the basis of anti-Semitism, promoting anti-Semitism, denouncing the Jew as the enemy of the Christian masses, focusing on the presence of Jewish bankers, ignoring, of course, or the fact that the vast majority of Jews were hardly bankers and they were in the middle class or in the proletariat. He was totally cynical about this. As a matter of fact, Karl Lueger himself personally had many Jewish friends, and when this was pointed out to him that why was he, socializing with Jews, he said, "Well, I'll decide who a Jew is." It was a political movement, and he was, in fact, one of the ideological and political inspirations for Adolf Hitler, who spent much of his 20s in the city of Vienna. So the significance of anti-Semitism as a political movement with political aims of the most reactionary character associated with the defense of capitalism was well known. And the opposition to anti-Semitism became more and more centered in the working class. It's important to note that the mayor of Berlin in the late 1890s and early 1900s was Paul Sanger, who was Jewish. The socialist movement fought relentlessly against anti-Semitism, and it explained that anti-Semitism was an instrument of political reaction. And it rejected the conception that anti-Semitism was some sort of timeless phenomenon which could never be done away with. That anti-Semitism, like all other forms of extreme chauvinism, racial hatreds, required the overthrow of capitalism and the end of the national state system. And now this historical understanding has been repudiated, of course, by the Zionists, who have a vested interest in trying to present anti-Semitism as this timeless, unending phenomena. About 20 or 25 years ago, a book was published by Daniel Goldhagen. I think its title was Ordinary Germans, in which it attempted to explain the Holocaust in terms of the working out of an almost genetically grounded German hatred of Jews. The Germans were born with a sort of anti-Semitic gene, and that's what determined the Holocaust. Significantly, his book barely referenced the existence of a socialist movement. It barely referenced the existence of the Marxist movement, or in any way related the events in Germany to the political struggles, that is, the defeat of the working class. So so the present definition of anti-Semitism, or this semantic inversion, involves identifying opposition to the Israeli state and its political regime to the timeless hatred of Jews that has always existed. What makes this not just reactionary, but utterly absurd, is, of course, that it even utilizes this swear word against Jews. I mean, Jews who oppose Zionism, and there are, of course, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jews in the United States, or millions, who are against and horrified by what Israel is doing. They too are anti-Semites. So the whole objective historical meaning of the term has been totally falsified. It has no relationship to reality. And in fact, the time has come when this term is used. It just should be ignored, repudiated. People want to use absurd language and false language to slander their opponents. Well, it's not good. Was not obligated to answer them as if their arguments have any seriousness. Of Netanyahu, whose politics resembles that of Hitler far more than that of even the average Jewish democratic liberal. I mean, he can use a term till he's blue in the face. It doesn't change the fact that his use of the language is politically motivated, false, and the Zionists who utilize it are utilizing it in order to impart to the term a meaning which is the absolute opposite of its historical meaning. And I might finally make the point that there is no greater gift to the genuine anti-Semites, and they certainly do exist, and they are gathering strength, that they have been handed a gift by the crimes of the Israeli state. And it's very, very important to very clearly and emphatically separate this slander and to make clear that the Israeli state does not speak for the collectivity of Jewish people or people who happen to be Jewish by religion any more than Hitler spoke for all of the German people. It's often ignored and forgotten that the barbarism of the German state was to a great extent determined by the fact that there existed such massive opposition within Germany to Hitler. The first concentration camp that was built in Germany, its construction began in March 1933, was the camp known as Dachau, in the town of Dachau. And the first prisoners were the socialists and the communists, the trade union leaders, the left-wing intellectuals. And so just as the socialist movement, and it's a matter of historical truth, never attributed Nazism to the German people as such, and that the Nazis had no right to claim that they spoke on behalf of the German people, the Zionists have no right to speak or claim to speak on behalf of all those who have as their religion Judaism. I think, Dave, you have to mute yourself.
I'm sorry, I make the mistake that everybody makes, apparently, at least once. Well, I hope that the discussion so far, the discussion already has convinced people of the value and the substance and the seriousness of these issues and of these works and of the content included. I would encourage the viewers, listeners, watchers to go to Mehring Books, the publishing arm of the Socialist Equality Party, Mehring.com, where you can purchase Sounding the Alarm, Socialism Against War, The Logic of Zionism, as well as other works by Dave North and other leaders of the IC and great classics of Marxism. We're also, I think it's worth noting, we're beginning today the Mehring Books holiday sale, which will go through January 5th. You can get up to 25% off Mehring titles and 20% off titles from other publishers. And orders over $50 within the continental U.S. receive free shipping. I do think it becomes a question in these very complex and to many confusing times that we keep our wits about us, and that one of the great tools in that is to build up a library of Marxism and the Marxist classics, and as well as the contemporary works of the Marxist movement. Getting back to the past decade, and obviously one of its most horrifying episodes or ongoing scenarios, of course, is the pandemic, which has been a monumental catastrophe for humanity, with more than 27 million, an estimated more than 27 million people having been killed, 400 million suffering from long COVID globally. Of course, more than 1 million dead in this country. At the 2020 May Day rally, you characterized the pandemic as a trigger event. And if you can put up those slides on the pandemic can be compared to the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Ferdinand and his wife on June 28, 1914. This incident led rapidly to the outbreak of World War I, a little more than 5 weeks later, in early August 1914. Had the assassination not taken place, it's doubtful that war would have come in August. But sooner or later, in the winter of 1914 or in the following year, the economic and geopolitical contradictions of European and global capitalism and imperialism would have led to a military conflagration. The assassination accelerated the historical process, but it acted upon pre-existing and highly inflammable socioeconomic and political conditions. The same can be said of the pandemic. And at the 2021 rally, Dave North remarked, "It's an indisputable fact that the subordination of human lives to financial interests is responsible for millions of untimely deaths. The overwhelming majority of COVID-19 deaths should have been prevented. The devastating impact of the pandemic is due far more to the economic interests of the capitalist class than to the biological structure of the virus." Can you comment further on this analysis of the pandemic as a trigger event and the significance of the International Committee's response, which was a unique response to this ongoing world historic catastrophe?
Well, just recalling the beginning of the pandemic, the initial discussions of the event, it was in January that we first became aware, as the news began to leak out, that there was a strange infection taking place. And we began discussing it. What was this? Was this serious? And I must say that based on the information which was available, even by the end of January, it was apparent, based on information which then existed, that we were confronted with an illness which, if it was not effectively responded to, could lead to millions of deaths. And so those who go back over the coverage of the WSWS, I think the first article appeared around the 24th or so of January. And from that point on, we were following it relentlessly. And placed this event within, again, a broader historical context, given the nature of the crisis of capitalism, the devastating crisis of social infrastructure, and above all, the subordination of all social interests to the accumulation of profit. It would be dangerously naive to believe that the ruling elites and their governments were going to respond in any sort of progressive and effective way to this crisis. And moreover, the dominance of the nation over global interests, of national interests over international interests, would mean that there would not be the type of coordinated, systematic, global response which was necessary in order to fight this virus. And so I think the record demonstrates that the response of the World Socialist website was extremely farsighted and correct. And I think we have a right to be proud of the fact that the editorial board collectively all over the world has produced well over 5,000, 6,000 articles on the subject. Now, as for the concept of a trigger event, again, suddenly amidst all the already far advanced tensions and pressures that existed, for example, we've been discussing the war in Ukraine and the escalation toward global conflict, suddenly there was this new event, which, if our analysis was correct, was going to vastly intensify all the pre-existing pressures, political, social, economic, which of course it certainly did, and all the tensions which already existed would become all the more severe. And that's what we meant by a trigger event, and we've been correct. I think looking back, now we are approaching the 5th anniversary of this global disaster, and contradicting the claims, far from being over. I mean, it has been now embedded in the social and political structure of every country. And I think it's had far-reaching consequences. Obviously, we've spoken of the economic, the social, the medical, so on, these contradictions. I think it's had a profound psychological consequence, which hasn't been adequately investigated. I mean, this is a disease which has affected the entire planet. The vast majority of the world's population have had at least one episode of COVID. And even if their own symptoms were mild or got over it quickly, there is now a great deal of evidence that COVID as a multi-organ disease has far-reaching consequences. There was an article which appeared in the New York Times just in the last few days, which reported that new analyses establishes that COVID is responsible for subsequent cardiovascular disease, and particularly among people who have already had some level of cardiovascular disease, it may lead to their untimely death. It may take years off their lives. So this is something which is continuing. And again, just to expand on this question of its sort of psychological impact, I think one of the effects of this crisis has been, or to desensitize people to the reality of mass death, mass suffering. And certainly I think that there has been an effort to utilize that for the most reactionary purposes, to undermine global awareness of the extreme dangers and fragility of life on the planet, the implications. I mean, just as the significance of the pandemic is being downplayed, the significance of nuclear war is being downplayed. There is this strange divorce from reality. I mean, here in the last few weeks, last week, we're confronted with the fact that we could be in a all-out nuclear war. It is certainly possible. We're not saying that is going to happen, but the fact that the United States is authorizing the use of missile strikes on Russia, something that was unthinkable during the Cold War in the period of the 60s and 70s, simply because it was understood that that could lead to a full-scale exchange of nuclear bombardment by Russia and the United States. The implications of that seem not to be clear, and I have the sense that the affluent middle class, if one follows the comments which appear in the New York Times by its readers or in the Washington Post, they seem to think that the best protection against nuclear war is a good stock portfolio with overvalued tech stocks and perhaps a few bitcoins, that somehow personal wealth is going to save them from a nuclear catastrophe. No, it won't. And so I think the pandemic has had far-reaching implications. It's hard to imagine that, it would have been difficult to imagine that a global disaster of this scale, which is ongoing, and one can be certain as the Thanksgiving season approaches and people are out among their families, friends, shopping, mass gatherings, that we're not going to see yet another major upsurge. And there always is the danger that one of these upsurges is going to be with a variant of the virus, which once again produces the most extreme consequences. What is the political point? Like all the other elements of the world crisis today, it can be overcome only through the struggle of the working class on an international scale against capitalism and the nation-state system upon which it's grounded. The bourgeoisie is incapable of dealing in any progressive sense. And just look at the selections of Trump. I mean, certifiable maniacs, at least in their attitude to social health policy, are being given the most responsible position. I mean, we really, in the year of our Lord 2025, will have the public health system dominated by maniacs such as Robert F. Kennedy, people who don't believe in the efficacy of vaccination. Just a few days ago, we were having a discussion, and I recalled that, not to glorify the past, but there was a time when, and I'm old enough to remember, when the polio vaccine was brought out, that Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin, the founders of effective vaccines against polio, were looked upon as saviors. And popular Hollywood films of an earlier period even glorified the work of Dr. Paul Ehrlich, who developed the vaccine against syphilis, or a biography of Louis Pasteur. All of this, excuse me, all of this is now being challenged and rejected. So we're seeing a terrible social retrogression, which has been, not that we didn't have enough evidence, but it's certainly being revealed by the response to the pandemic.
An important point, the psychological impact of the pandemic. I mean, this is a question that goes beyond this discussion, but I just, as you're speaking about it, I mean, some of the peculiarities of the Trump phenomena, although obviously there are various factors involved, including long-term economic and social processes, but to sort of let the bodies pile high, the rise to the surface of the Musks, the Hulk Hogan's, the Joe Rogans, I mean, really reactionary imbeciles for whom suffering and other people's difficulties means, and who proclaim their indifference to humanity and to any sympathy for those who are suffering, has something to do with the impact of the pandemic. We're obviously speaking here in a compressed fashion about numerous earth-shaking events: the US-NATO war against Russia, the Gaza Genocide and the mass opposition to it, the COVID pandemic, and the Trump coup plot and his re-election now. And to the impressionist or the superficial observer, these are four different crises that have virtually no interrelationship, no interconnection. Obviously, for the Marxists, they do, and they're of significance for the working class. But along those lines, I want to turn to the question of the Trump and the coup attempt of January 2021, and we have the slide there. Speaking, this is I think before that, speaking just 114 days after the armed fascist assault on Congress organized by the previous president, Biden, protected by troops and police that surrounded the Capitol building, declared that the American people have stared into the abyss of insurrection and autocracy, pandemic, and pain. He described the events of January 6, 2021 as an existential crisis, a test of whether our democracy could survive. He then stated that, this is Biden, he then stated that the struggle is far from over and proceeded to call into question whether democracy will survive in the United States. This is from the 2021 May Day speech. The question of whether our democracy will long endure is both ancient and urgent, as old as our republic, still vital today. So the question, here we are, nearly in December 2024, on the eve of Trump Part 2. What has the 2024 election shown? Can democracy survive in America under the present system, or is it at death's door? I think those are fundamental questions.
Well, looking back at Biden's speech, one would have to say the answer given by the 2024 election is that democracy cannot survive if democracy remains dependent upon the existence of the capitalist system. What we old-fashioned Marxists would call bourgeois democracy is doomed if the bourgeoisie rules. The fate of democracy depends entirely now on the conquest of power by the working class. And here I think we come to really the most basic issues of the Marxist, Trotskyist analysis of the contemporary world. We take very seriously the issues of democracy. I must say that one of the I think we can be very proud of the fact that the World Socialist website was almost alone in the both before January 6th and in the immediate aftermath of January 6th of warning that Trump was preparing a coup against existing constitutional forms. And in the aftermath of January 6th, there was a tendency, particularly among the pseudo-left, that is the petty bourgeois representatives of a sort of fraudulent leftism, which serves the interests of more affluent and complacent sections of the middle class, to downplay the significance of what happened on January 6th, to joke about it almost. We believed and we said this was a serious and, in a sense, unprecedented event in modern American history. The President of the United States had attempted to overthrow the constitutional system, and as a matter of fact, came very close to succeeding. And we made the point a number of times that if in the course of January 6th, Trump, those who broke into the Capitol, had managed to take one or another Democratic leader hostage, I don't have any doubt that the Democratic Party would have accepted the continuation of the Trump administration and would have surrendered the election just as they surrendered the election in 2000. And if I can recall that event, the assessment which was made by the World Socialist website at the time was that the outcome of the election, the acceptance of the open theft of an election by the Republican Party with the support of the Supreme Court, demonstrated that there did not really exist a significant constituency for democracy within the ruling elites. And how could there be? After all, how can there be democracy in a society in which an infinitesimal fraction of the population controls such vast amounts of wealth? And it is not just a propaganda phrase or a slogan to say that we, as our webinar of a few days ago stressed, that we have government of the oligarchy, by the oligarchy, and for the oligarchy. I mean, the cabinet which Trump is assembling consists of loads of mega millionaires or billionaires. He doesn't go anywhere without, it seems, Elon Musk at his side. And so in such a system of oligarchic control, you're not going to have democracy. And so what we're seeing right now in the emergence or the building of this regime, this will be a regime of a different character. It will be a regime of war and ever-growing levels of political repression. And the central point is, therefore, that the fate of democracy in the United States is bound up with the struggle of the working class and the establishment of a socialist society. If I can go back into American history, in his famous speeches, the much maligned Abraham Lincoln, denounced again by the petty bourgeois denizens of identity politics, but in one of his great speeches, one of his most famous speeches, he said Democracy in America can't endure if the country is half slave and half free. It will be one thing or the other. And what he was saying was implicitly, either the United States got rid of the slave system, or it will cease to be a democracy. And he was true to his word. The American Civil War, one of the great revolutions in history, put an end to the slave system and laid the basis for a further, though not non-contradictory, process of progress. Now, today, I think we clearly see that the Democratic Party had 4 years to deal with the consequences of the Trump coup. They could do nothing. All of their policies disoriented, demoralized. None of the fundamental issues which led to the coup socially were addressed. More people died of COVID under Biden than had even under Trump. The Democratic Party devoted itself relentlessly to really what its only agenda was: war. Now, they were determined to pursue the war in Ukraine. They then became the enthusiastic supporters of the genocide in Gaza, and all other social and political questions were of no significance. And they cleared the path for Trump's return to power. And all the analyses of the election shows that it was not a groundswell of popularity for Trump which brought him into power, but the collapse of support for the Democratic Party. So political conclusions must be drawn. I mean, if you want to defend democracy, a movement of a completely different character has to be built. It's not going to be saved by the Democratic Party and appeals to different levels or layers of that party or to different sections of the ruling elite. The critical question is to develop a movement in the working class, which is in a process of political radicalization, and provide a genuine alternative to the reactionary agenda, the fascistic agenda of the Trump government. Again, I think a further point which really needs to be made: Trump is working off of the frustrations of broad masses of people. And that is common of all fascist movements. They work off frustrations, they work off of pessimism, they work off of demoralization. The socialist movement works off of hope, confidence, a belief that the future can be better. And that's what the World Socialist website, that's what the Socialist Equality Party, and the International Committee is working toward, to revive within the working class a socialist perspective. The fight for socialism is a conscious struggle. Socialism will not just emerge because it's historically inevitable. It's only historically inevitable to the extent that there is a conscious struggle waged to make this inevitability. By that we mean to work on the real existing contradictions that exist and develop the socialist solution, which is made possible by those contradictions, but they won't happen automatically. And I think that, we're at a point where everyone's got to sort of, those who are serious, workers, youth, intellectuals who consider themselves to be progressive, professionals, to ask themselves, where are we going? What is going to stop the political nightmare of Trumpism, which is, by the way, not simply an American phenomenon. We see it in country after country. What's going to put a stop to it? We see the indifference of the ruling elites to the danger of war. In one of his great speeches, I think it was in July 1917, during a period of, within the revolution, of a sudden outburst of reaction, Trotsky said, "Reaction will continue until it receives a blow in its solar plexus." And the time has come for reaction to receive a blow in its solar plexus, and it has to be delivered by the working class. And so the turn has to be to the working class and the development of the social struggles of the working class on an international scale to imbue the working class with a more advanced and correct perspective. The great strength which the socialist movement has, and excuse the speechifying, but I want to take advantage of the opportunity this discussion provides, and the whole purpose of the books which we're promoting in this meeting, But the purpose of the socialist movement is to bring forward, to make the working class aware and conscious of its historical role. Of course, this is a challenge. We have to overcome the legacy of Stalinism, past defeats, the confusion introduced into the working class by all manners of reactionary movements, the terrible impact of pseudo-leftism promoting race, gender, all sorts of secondary and tertiary identity issues as a substitute for class consciousness. And in that regard, I might make the point that one of the ideological founders of Zionism, Moses Hess, when he justified Zionist ideologies in his work from Rome to Jerusalem, he directly challenged Marx, who had said the history of mankind is the history of class struggle. And Moses Hess said, no, the history of mankind is a history of racial conflict. That was a reactionary perspective then in the 1860s, and of course it's 160 years later. It is a horrifically backward perspective, and we can see the consequences of it in the Gaza Genocide. So I hope that everyone who's watching this program will draw certain conclusions. You know, serious times require serious politics. This is not a time for hopeless introspection, to bewail the state of the world and say how everything went wrong. You know, you want to change the world and do something about it. Join our movement. Commit yourself to the struggle for socialism. That is the only way forward. I mean, how many more lessons do we need? How much more do we have to see to be convinced that there are no simple way out of this unfolding disaster? You know, it is, as Rosa Luxemburg so sharply stated, it's socialism or barbarism. Those are the alternatives. And how it's going to turn will depend and to be determined not by the working out of some inexorable fate, but by struggle. Again, if I can quote Trotsky, he once asked in the early 1930s, he said, answering the pessimists, he said, is the situation hopeless? He said, the word is not in our vocabulary. Struggle will decide. Struggle will decide whether the future is to be the barbarism which is being unleashed by capitalism in the form of fascism, nuclear war, or whether it's going to be resolved through the collective struggle of the working class within the United States and internationally for a new socialist reorganization of mankind and the progressive use of all the productive forces which we have, the enormous power of socialist, of modern technology to eliminate all the different forms of human suffering.
Well, I think those are critical questions. I mean, your speechifying, as you put it, is precisely the purpose, or one of the central purposes of this discussion. And I hope, again, I hope the readers, viewers, listeners will be convinced that there's an important connection between the perspective presented in these works and the ultimate outcome of the social struggle. That the success or failure of the social revolution depends on the development of this perspective in the working class. Again, along those lines, I want to encourage everyone listening, everyone watching, to go to Mehring.com and pick up these books, as well as other books. And there's the question of the holiday sale, which I referred to. Also, obviously, for fairly obvious reasons, we have no corporate sponsors. So we strongly urge you, as part of a developing commitment, to donate to the Socialist Equality Party, and as well to consider joining. We have to build a party, and this is what this meeting is about. We're going toward the end here, but I would like to ask Christoph, I believe he has another question or a final question that he would like to ask.
Yes, maybe one final question, because Dave, you spoke about the point that the same contradictions that are driving fascism and war are also providing the basis for a movement of the working class, and that the decisive question is a question of struggle. And in this regard, I would like to point to the fourth lecture in the book on the suicide of Aaron Bushnell, who, as a member of the army, wanted to protest against the Gaza Genocide by killing himself. And you show in this lecture, first of all, that this desperate act was an expression of a broader sentiment, resulting from the suppression of the class struggle. And then you sharply attack Chris Hedges, who glorified Bushnell's suicide as a messianic act to be emulated. And above all, you demonstrate the falsity of the political perspective underlying this by the political perspective of Chris Hedges. You write, to put the matter bluntly, Hedges' essay speaks to the pessimism, intellectual bankruptcy, and essentially reactionary character of middle-class pseudo-leftism, i.e. the ideological conceptions that generally predominate and on university campuses. In 1940, in the course of an internal party political struggle against an anti-Marxist tendency that had emerged in the American section of the Fourth International, Leon Trotsky noted that the greatest social revolution in history, the conquest of power by the Russian working class in October 1917, an earth-shaking event, was led by the party whose activity began not with the throwing of bombs, but with the defense and elaboration of dialectical materialist theory. And I think that is somehow our answer to this perspective that was brought forward by Hedges. And it's also maybe a good question for the conclusion of this meeting. Because what do you think? What's the significance of Hedges' response to Bushnell's suicide, and what is the Marxist attitude towards it? And that means what is the task of revolutionaries today?
Well, the suicide of Aaron Bushnell was a terribly tragic event. And the reason why I spoke as strongly as I did at the time was because, given the understandable emotions aroused by this tragedy, we felt that it was a responsibility. And when I use the word we, it's, I'm talking about myself as part of a movement, and which is constantly reviewing these issues and writing on developments in the World Socialist website, but that it was necessary to counter this pessimistic response, this highly individualist response, with a perspective. We don't want young people to emulate this sort of tragic and essentially hopeless response to political events. I mean, the world today is a world which is producing endless causes for legitimate outrage, moral outrage. If you are not angry and if you aren't repulsed by the crimes being committed by governments, which are being committed by the leaders of capitalist parties, by the debased level of culture, the glorification of every form of backwardness and violence, well, you're not going to make your way to socialism. Socialism isn't just a purely intellectual response. It has a profound and legitimate and necessary moral and ethical foundation, though the Marxists explain the moral and the ethical within a materialist framework. We're angry over these events, and we know that young people particularly feel a strong sense of outrage. At my point in life, I can still remember how I felt and how so many of my generation felt over the horrors being committed by the United States in Vietnam, and the bombing of villages, the defoliation of Vietnam, and the brutal crimes which were being committed within the United States, the unleashing of dogs in the South against African American protesters fighting for civil rights. We were angry, and we necessarily and inevitably associated the crimes of that period to what had taken place in the years, in the decades which, not that many before, in World War II, the Holocaust, or even the horrors of the First World War. So we felt enormously, really passionately about these events. We were fortunate to encounter a political perspective which enabled us to focus and direct that outrage politically and effectively. And so when we are confronted with a tragedy such as the death of Aaron Bushnell, yes, we reacted very, very sharply against any justification or attempt to glorify or to elevate martyrdom, personal martyrdom, as a solution to problems which can only find their solution through collective social struggle. I mean, I'm not questioning the sincerity of Chris Hedges. He's a gifted journalist, but the issue here is not, we're living in serious times, and the problem with pessimism is that it's a very simplistic, in my view, approach to political events. It's easy to be a pessimist. After all, so many terrible things are happening. It's easy to say, well, terrible things are happening and nothing but terrible things will continue to happen. I think a more thoughtful and indeed scientific approach to reality is one which sees within any series of events, even the most terrible, the potential for a counter-reaction. Revolutionary optimism isn't sort of a Panglossian happiness. Oh, everything will work out well. No, we're very aware that things can work out terribly. But revolutionary optimism identifies within any given objective situation the conflicting social forces. And one poses the question, does there exist within this existing situation a potential for a socialist transformation? And it does. Not because socialism is a better and more moral idea, but because socialism arises as a possibility out of the development of the existing contradictions of the capitalist mode of production and the presence within world society of a revolutionary force. The point which Marxism makes, and which is so important to understand, that the fact that the working class was oppressed was recognized by advanced thinkers even before Marx. But what was original in Marxism was, first of all, of course, the ability to explain the economic dynamics of that oppression, and also to demonstrate that the working class was not only an oppressed class, it was a revolutionary class. And Marx himself said that his principal achievement in the realm of political thought was to demonstrate that the outcome of this oppression would be the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, that insight is of such immense importance. that yes, there's a tremendous amount of confusion that prevails among workers. How could there not be? Look at all the lies they're told. Look at the nature of our media, the backwardness of its cultural life. One has often the impression that nothing frightens the bourgeoisie more than the fear that somewhere, someplace, people are thinking. And what we, however, working through all of that, need to focus attention on is always to pose the question, does there in all of this exist a social force that can change the situation? And that is the working class. Whatever the present level of confusion, the working class can be won to a socialist perspective, and that possibility is lodged in the actual unfolding struggles of the working class. We live in a period of, and we're witnessing, a growth of social struggle. The working class is going to make plenty of experiences with Trump and his crew. We are continuously engaged in the struggle of workers. The World Socialist website is directed toward the struggles of the working class, not just in the United States, but on a world scale. We've developed the International Workers' Alliance of rank and file committees, whose aim is to transfer power out of the hands of the reactionary bureaucracies to the shop floor and to create forms of struggle which will be effective. That is a perspective, and we have the possibility for its success lies not just in our individual determination as socialists, though that is a substantial factor, but in the fact that the socialist perspective corresponds to objective reality. And so, just to, again, a long answer to an important question, we say to the young people, devote yourself to building a socialist movement. Turn to the working class. You by yourselves can't change the world. You need a material force. You need a mass force, potentially more powerful than the capitalist class. And so look to the workplaces, look to the factories. Direct your political energies to the social force which has been demonstrated to be revolutionary. And in that way, I think that is the response which we give and the appeal that we make to young people. There is a way of changing the world. It's not through acts of martyrdom. That can't change anything. After all, we've witnessed so many protests during the past year. Has it changed anything? No. But when the workers come forward, they have the power to change things. And to the extent that the working class is armed with a revolutionary perspective, they can settle accounts with the capitalist system and the capitalist class. All of Mr. Musk's billions will not be sufficient to stop a movement of a class-conscious working class, which will expropriate him and leave to him a few million so he can lead a fairly pleasant life. But the social resources of society will be reorganized in the interests of broad masses of the population. That's the perspective we fight for.
Well, I think I trust it will be, it could be argued that we are dealing with a series of dense and complex issues. I'd like to raise one final one. In your book, Leon Trotsky and the Struggle for Socialism in the 21st Century, you address numerous fundamental Marxist, Trotskyist concepts. In particular, the lecture, Lenin, Trotsky, and the Marxism of the October Revolution, I think is central to understanding the difference between Marxism and the various petty bourgeois ideologies at the universities and elsewhere. You write, there can be no revolution without will, that is, without the highest degree of subjective determination. But will and determination must be guided by a correct appreciation of objective reality upon which the practice of the socialist movement must be based. From a theoretical standpoint, the rejection of the glorification of subjective will as a basis for political action separates Marxism from countless varieties petty bourgeois radical politics, including anarchism and Maoism, and of course, the most counter-revolutionary of mass middle-class movements, fascism. Obviously, you have touched upon or more some of these issues in your answers, but perhaps you can address directly why is it essential to base the socialist program on an objective, historically grounded, scientific understanding of class society and its history?
Well, the answer is, I think, the same that we would give to any social problem, even medical problem. Are we going to base ourselves on prayers, or are we going to base ourselves on a scientific understanding of the problems with which we are confronted? Again, to cite a passage from Trotsky, answering those who said that the answer to social problems is to appeal to the better angels of the spirit of the ruling class, to ask them to behave in a kinder, more gentle manner. And Trotsky answered, well, how is that different from praying for rain? Politics, political action must be based first and foremost on a correct evaluation of the dynamics of society. Without that, without an understanding of the objective situation, how is it possible to develop an effective political response? I mean, just consider the present situation. I mean, as I just said, we've seen many demonstrations against the Gaza protests. Why have they been ineffective? Why have they not changed anything? Because they're based, to a great extent, on an incorrect evaluation of the causes of the genocide itself. The separation of the genocide from the broader crisis of world capitalism, and a failure to recognize the role played by different political organizations. I mean, to develop an effective struggle against the war in Gaza or the threat of nuclear war means to break from the dominance of in the United States, from the Democratic Party or the bourgeois parties. And more fundamentally, even, to understand that the central contradictions of our time are not the contradictions focused on by middle-class politics. The focus on identity, whether it is racial identity, national identity, gender identity, sexual preference identity, these are not the issues which drive great historical struggles. Identity politics, to be blunt, is largely a politics of those layers of the middle class who want to effect a more favorable distribution of the wealth that is sloshing around at the very summit of society. They like to see some of those billions, made accessible. I think the term which they use, they reject, the Black nationalists, they reject the struggle for equality in favor of the demand for equity. Well, they're more or less saying they'd like to see their own stock portfolios filled with somewhat larger than they presently are, and therefore use appeals to race and nationality to effect that. That's not only is it selfish, but it's an incorrect evaluation of the real dynamics of society. It does not explain the operative contradictions that exist. The fundamental reality which must be recognized as the foundation for effective political action is, first of all, that the ultimate source of the political and social problems of our time are rooted in the existence of a system of private ownership of the means of production, and a system which is grounded in the nation state. The answer to that is a program which sets out to abolish the exploitation of the working class, which ends private ownership of the means of production and transfers the wealth of society to the broad mass of the population under their democratic control, and moreover, recognizes that the effective implementation of that program is not a national, but an international task. That the social revolution is not a national program. We are now marking what is just about the centenary of the emergence of the Trotskyist movement. A seminal text of the Trotskyist movement was a pamphlet which Trotsky wrote in the autumn of 1924, which was titled Lessons of October. In that brilliant essay, which was an examination of the experience of October 1917 and the major lessons of that experience, what Trotsky established was, of course, first of all, the necessity of the building of the role of revolutionary leadership, the critical role in particular of Lenin, and his own role, though he didn't reference himself individually, but the role of leadership. But he also stressed that at the very heart, in terms of perspective and the working out of the necessary response of the Bolshevik Party at that time to the crisis, which reached its climax in October 1917, was the fact that the Bolshevik strategy and the taking of power derived itself not so much from a national perspective of conditions just within Russia, but rather from an international perspective, that the necessity of the conquest of power by the working class in Russia was determined by international conditions manifested in the First World War itself as the highest expression of those global contradictions. Now, in the immediate aftermath, right after he published that essay, there was a ferocious attack on Trotsky, and it was centered on the repudiation of precisely the international perspective which Trotsky advanced. And it was in the course of that polemical assault on Trotsky that Stalin wrote the article in which he advanced, with the support of Bukharin, the theory of socialism in one country, the idea that the path to socialism could be achieved on a fundamentally national basis, and rejecting for the first time explicitly the internationalist strategy that had motivated the October Revolution of 1917. That remains the central question today. The strategy upon which the socialist movement must be based. And the only way one can understand even the present situation is if one proceeds from the necessity of mobilizing the working class on a world scale. And again, this is not, let me stress, this is not some pie in the sky. We already are seeing that when struggles begin, workers more and more tend to see their conflict and identify their conflict in international terms. Even the protests which we saw against Gaza, they were world protests. Workers are becoming increasingly aware that they cannot challenge effectively the policies of the corporations in their own country, corporations which are organized on a transnational basis, unless they find means of effecting a fighting international alliance with their class brothers and sisters all over the world. So what is so critical to understand as we survey the present situation is that the answers lie in a global program. These are the central, there is a solution, a global solution, and it involves the mobilization of the working class, that our rejection of, quite correctly, of all these different forms of pseudo-leftism, which you referenced, Dave, in your question, is that in the final analysis, if we want to just deal with this on a theoretical basis, all the popular forms of pseudo-leftism, which have their base in the university, whether in the forms of the many varieties of so-called Western Marxism, Frankfurt School, or the postmodernism. What were they really? They were means of emasculating Marxism, removing Marxism from its historical connection with the struggles of the working class, and reinterpreting and really falsifying Marxism and left-wing politics as largely the politics of middle-class protest movements. To take Marxism and even more broadly left-wing politics as far as possible away from the working class. And that has been its major characteristics. And I think the election itself, I mean, there's been a lot of commentary since the election that the big mistake of the Democratic Party was that it forgot about the working class. Well, that was, of course, ideologically prepared by all the various pseudo-left organizations. I mean, the DSA is perhaps the most reactionary of them all. But again, these are more broadly international tendencies, whether it's Syriza in Greece or Podemos in Spain or Mélenchon in France. I mean, there to be, all of these organizations and tendencies have one essential common characteristic: the rejection of the fact that Marxism, left-wing politics, socialist politics is historically, necessarily, economically, politically, only possible within the framework of a movement of the working class on a global scale. And so that's why all of the problems of today are perhaps summed up in the slogan, turn to the working class, build a world party of socialist revolution. That's the task of our time. And, optimism, which I've spoken in support of, is not intended to suggest that we have forever to accomplish this. There are many, many reasons to believe that we are now coming to the climactic stage of what Trotsky called the death agony of capitalism. Either the capitalist system is ended, finally, or it will destroy human civilization. That's the way political questions are posed today. And so the central question now is the development of this world movement, the revival of a genuine socialist movement in the working class. And when we say that Trotskyism is the Marxism of the 21st century, what we mean is that Trotskyism, the Trotskyist movement, is the embodiment, or is the embedded in the Trotskyist movement are all the historical lessons of the past century. One final point. Our movement has come under sharp attack. There's been a book written called The Twilight of Trotskyism. And the central argument, amazingly made by its author, an academic in London, is that Trotskyism, its great flaw, is that it claims that the situation we face is socialism or barbarism, and it discounts the possibility of social reform. That we're pessimistic toward the enormous range of opportunities which the reformist program is demonstrating. I think the author must have been writing the book inside of a closet. He has not taken note of anything which has taken place over the last decade, not to mention the last 5 years or even the past year. The present situation is hardly one which speaks to the power of the reformist perspective. What's been the fate of Corbynism? What's been the fate of all these different forms of pseudo-leftism which reject a genuine socialist and therefore revolutionary response? So again, I hope that everyone will get a copy of the two books, but also really think seriously about what's being said and make the decision. Your New Year's resolution for 2025 should be to join the Socialist Equality Party. It's one of its sister parties in Europe, Asia, throughout the world, in Latin America, where this is a world movement. Make the decision to help us build this movement and establish, once again, a powerful global revolutionary movement of the working class. Again, you got to put on your microphone.
Sorry, I clicked on it, but it didn't take. I think that's an appropriate concluding note. I hope that the viewer or listener will have found it interesting, and if it's not too pretentious a word, enlightening on a whole number of issues. I mean, it's part of an ongoing discussion and an ongoing fight that has to be taken up, of course, in many, many different venues, before many, many different audiences, in sections of the working class all over the world. One of the things I think that I hope will have been impressed upon the viewer is the need for a seriousness about these questions as the only basis for action. As Rosa Luxemburg said at the time of the 1905 Russian Revolution, she recalled that Wilhelm Liebknecht, the pioneering German socialist, had said in his reminiscences about Karl Marx that for Marx, politics was for him above all else ein Studium, something to be systematically studied. And in this respect, Marx should be a model for us all. Well, he should continue to be a model for us all. I would again urge everyone to go to Mehring Books, mehring.com. In addition to these two new books, there are numerous others that are really of vital significance to an understanding of contemporary events and their antecedents, their historical roots, their sources. And again, I want to point to the holiday sale, which is beginning. In addition, I would encourage, again, the donations to the SEP, to this party, to the website, as vital to its building, vital to its construction. And finally, to consider joining the International Committee, the Socialist Equality Party, in whatever country you happen to be residing in or live in. Take your place in this absolutely world historical struggle. That's the message of this, central message of this meeting, I believe. And with that, I'd like to conclude.